political settlement that allows any meaningful national self-determination to the Palestinians and the 22% of Palestine that technically they're supposed to have under international law. Well, those are the policies right before our eyes. I haven't talked about the constant, regular brutality and sadism, which is serious. But that's the diplomacy, and Mitchell is bound by it. He's not given any he may be a perfectly good negotiator, but he has no opportunity to do anything as long as the United States remains committed to those policies. Well, there are things that can be done. In fact, one good suggestion was made by Amnesty International. It's now considered in the United States and Israel a kind of a radical left organization, but I hope we don't have to talk about that. In the several human rights reports about the U.S.-Israeli war in Gaza, they call it an Israeli war, but that's politeness. There have been quite a few human rights investigations, and one of the most important of them, hence the least publicized, was an Amnesty International report which went through the weaponry that was used in the attack on Gaza, found, of course, that almost all of it comes from the United States, including white phosphorus and other high-tech weaponry, and it called for an arms embargo on both sides. Well, you can't call an arms embargo on Hamas because no state publicly, at least, provides them with arms. But you can call for, and of course, most overwhelmingly that means Israel. So they called for an arms embargo on Israel for good reason, because its actions violate international law, and U.S. shipment of arms to Israel violates U.S. law. The U.S. law is quite explicit that arms cannot be sent except for the purpose of defense. And of course, I might say a word about that. Israel, of course, claims that all the actions I described are in self-defense. But, that claim is meaningless. Everything that every state, when it uses force, reflexively says it's for self-defense. Like when Hitler invaded Poland, it was to defend Germany from the wild terror of the Poles and so on. If you can find an exception to that in history, I'd kind of be interested. So to say it's in self-defense is like saying 2 + 2 = 4. You have to ask, is there any merit to that claim? Well, is there? Let's take the separation fence going through the West Bank. Now, what does that have to do with self-defense? If Israel wanted to build a wall that would keep it secure, it would build it on the border. It would make it impregnable, a mile high, tanks on all sides. This is an annexation wall, has nothing to do with defense. Take the attack on Gaza. It's uniform in the United States, including the human rights reports, to say, yes, Israel had the right to attack. It has a right to defend itself against Hamas rockets. There is a right of self-defense. That's true. Everyone agrees that a state has a right of self-defense. But that's not even the issue. The issue is, which is never discussed, did it have a right of self-defense by force? Okay, that's different from a right of self-defense. Now, international law is quite clear on that, as is common sense. You have a right to use force in self-defense if you've exhausted peaceful means. That's a precondition. Well, the U.S. and Israel not only didn't exhaust peaceful means, they refused to try them. And they refused to try them because they knew they were going to work. There were clear, peaceful means that could be used. In fact, there had been a ceasefire. It was called in June 2008. And Israel concedes publicly that during the ceasefire, there wasn't a single Hamas rocket. And Israel broke the ceasefire in November by sending troops into the Gaza Strip and killing a bunch of Hamas activists. And then rockets started in response. But then Hamas continued to offer to renew the ceasefire. And the Israeli cabinet considered it. We have the public record and decided not to. And the U.S., of course, never mentioned it. Well, that alone completely undermines any claim to the right of force. If they fired one bullet into the Gaza, it would have been a crime. But the discussion is all about disproportionate use of force, which is, again, an evasion You don't talk about disproportionate use of force unless there's a right to the use of force in the first place, which there wasn't. And if you go case by case, there are no security issues. Of course, there are security issues, but they're largely self-generated because there are opportunities for peaceful settlement. Well, the United States has been blocking them and continues to block them, and so does Obama. And that's another good case for preventive diplomacy. I'll stop.
As we get microphones out, I'd like for people to think about questions they have for Professor Chomsky. Again, focusing on the Middle East, focusing on the first term of Barack Obama, focusing on George Mitchell's role there, also focusing on the role of Hillary Rodham Clinton, who's playing an interesting role in this whole quote-unquote peace effort. Do we have microphones? One right there. Do we have a second right there? Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and please make certain that once you get the microphone, you speak right into it so we can hear your question. Please raise your hand first. Let's start right down here.
I'll start. Thank you very much, Professor. Terrific speech. It seemed after 9/11 that Bush's policy with Israel largely fell under the war on terror, and there was a lot of support with it. Kind of fell into the axis of evil scheme and all that. How would you relate that to the rationale of the Obama administration in terms of how they relate to Palestinian self-determination, Israel's response to terror, whatnot?
It's about the same. It's hard. The war on terror is a kind of an interesting concept. What we are supposed to think is that George Bush declared a war on terror after September 11th. That's not quite accurate. He redeclared a war on terror. The war on terror was declared by Ronald Reagan in 1981 as he came into office. He announced, and his administration announced, that state-directed international terrorism is the plague of the modern age, return to barbarism in our time. It's going to be the core of our policy. And then they proceeded to deal with it by carrying out massive terrorist wars, which practically destroyed Central America, killed over 1 million people in southern Africa, and then supported the invasion of Lebanon, just a massive terrorist war. So that's kind of out of history, because we're not supposed to talk about our terrorism. So therefore, that war on terror is kind of submerged. What about Bush's war on terror? About the same. It has almost nothing to do with reducing terror. I mean, terror is real. 9/11 happened. It's bad. It was a real crime. Actually, if you try going to Latin America, you may find that people call it the second 9/11. The reason is there was another 9/11, September 11th, 1973, in Chile, which by any objective standard was much worse. I can go through the details if you like. And we know who was responsible for that, people like Henry Kissinger and others. So yes, there was massive terror. 9/11, our 9/11 was another one. And if you want to, when there is a case of terror, a major crime, there are ways to react to reduce the terror. And they were understood. So in the case of what we call 9/11, second one, if you wanted to reduce, if your goal was to reduce terror, what you would have done is use the options that were available. So for example, the jihadi movement, which is a broad movement, was highly critical of Osama bin Laden, and 9/11. There were fatwas coming from the radical clerics in Al-Azhar University, kind of the main Islamic center, condemning bin Laden and Al-Qaeda for this. And if you wanted to reduce the threat of terror, what would have been done is to exploit the opportunity to break up the jihadi movement, to separate this violent militant element from its base of support. Okay, that's the natural way to reduce the threat of terror. That's, in fact, what Mitchell succeeded in doing in Northern Ireland. Instead, the U.S. decided to escalate the threat of terror. by welding the jihadi movement back together, first by attacking Afghanistan, then by attacking Iraq. And that's exactly what happened. So, for example, the invasion of Iraq, it was predicted by just about every intelligence agency that it would increase the threat of terror for a very simple reason. Terror doesn't come out of nowhere. You know, it's not because people decide I want to blow myself up. There's a background for it, and the background are grievances, and sometimes the grievances are legitimate, as in Northern Ireland. So if one of the leading about terror in Iraq, I'll come back to this. Intelligence agencies predicted the invasion would increase the threat of terror, as indeed it did, far beyond what was anticipated. So using quasi-governmental statistics, terror increased by a factor of 7. It's a big jump the year after the invasion of Iraq, as anticipated, but more. And we can go through other cases. Protection of a population from terror or other violence is usually a low priority of states, not a high priority. And that's true of the United States as well. So, yeah, it's sort of down there somewhere, but not a major priority. That's easy to show. Furthermore, what do you do about 9/11 itself? Well, it was a criminal act. When there's a criminal act, the first thing you do is try to figure out who perpetrated it. That wasn't so simple in this case. About 8 months later, the head of the FBI, after the most intensive international investigation in history, said that the FBI was still unable to really pinpoint the blame. They said, "We believe," it's the word that was used, "that the plot may have been hatched in Afghanistan, but was probably implemented in the United Arab Emirates and in Germany." Okay, so that's what they believed 8 months afterwards. Well, okay, if you're trying to find perpetrators of a criminal act, you go beyond your beliefs until you're pretty confident who carried it out, and then you work to apprehend them. If it's an international case, you get international support, which has been very easy in this case, and then bring them to a fair trial. That doesn't mean Guantanamo or Bagram. Well, that's the way to deal with criminal acts, assuming you want to reduce terror. Okay, if reducing terror is not your concern, or a very low concern, then you do the kinds of things that were done. Use force and violence to achieve your other objectives. I could go on with many other examples. So as you may know, there was a 9/11 commission that was formed over the objections of the Bush administration, but was formed a high-level commission to recommend means to reduce the threat of terror. And if you look over their they reconstituted themselves later because they were quite angry that none of their recommendations weren't being carried out. And if you look, yes, they weren't being carried out. So, for example, one of their recommendations was to fortify the border, the Canadian border. That's the poorest border for the United States. I mean, you and I could cross the Canadian border with a suitcase with a small nuclear weapon in it. I mean, you just go through the forests, you know, it's a basically unguarded border. So one recommendation was, okay, reinforce the border. Well, the Bush administration responded by reinforcing the border, namely the Mexican border, which was not considered a threat, because the threat that the people who are fleeing from the effects of NAFTA and the U.S. terror in Central America, the need to keep them out is far higher than the need to protect the people in New York from a nuclear explosion. And it goes that way step by step. I mean, governments are not the benevolent agencies. They're power systems. And they carry out policies in the interest of those who dominate and control them. And protecting populations is a low priority. Israel's a case in point. It could have security, but prefers expansion.
Thank you. Another question? Yes, sir, right here. Do we have a microphone right down here, please? Right up there.
No.
Go with that. Number 3.
What worries me is what's going to happen in this country. Obama raised such exaggerated expectations, such great hopes in people, precisely because he was an unknown. I recall reading that a Peruvian peasant was asked why he voted for a particular candidate for presidency. He said, because I know nothing about him. And I'm afraid that's what happened in this country. People voted for Obama because they knew nothing about what he really was going to carry out. And it's a very dangerous situation when you raise exaggerated high hopes and then you dash them down. We know what happened in France after 1968. De Gaulle came back to power with a vengeance. The Labour Party disappointed people in England in the 60s, and the Thatcher regime came in.
Yeah.
Carter disappointed people in this country, and we got Reagan. What's going to happen, as seems to be starting right now, when this exaggerated hopes are dashed down? Do we have real dangers here, and how can we fight that?
Yeah, you're quite right. And in fact, Obama and his campaign managers made sure you would know nothing about him, or very little about him. I mean, if you look back at the campaign, the slogans were hope and change. What hope for what? You know, what change? Well, at that point, it kind of evaporates. Why hope and change? Well, you know, campaign managers are intelligent enough to read polls, and they knew that 80% of the population thought the country's going in the wrong direction. Okay, hope and change. In fact, those were McCain's slogans too, except he didn't do it as well. Obama made it primarily because the financial institutions, who have enormous power in the country, mainly thanks to Reagan and Clinton, they preferred him to McCain. So they poured money into the Obama campaign way beyond McCain, and that's the core of the funding. And yes, he managed to make it, you know, over to win the election. And it shouldn't come to us as a surprise to anyone who knows anything about American political history that they're being paid off. Just take a look at the front pages every day. The big problem for the big banks now is that the profits and the bonuses are so high that they're getting a bad press. You know, so they have to figure out some way to conceal it by, say, taking them in stocks instead of money. So you're kind of borrowing money from the public instead of stealing it. You know, so sure, they're getting paid off for having put Obama in office, but the other programs are, well, you know what's happening to them. He's probably a nice man. I don't know. But there shouldn't, just as you said, there should be no surprise. They were very careful to keep it quiet. And that's characteristic of U.S. elections. The U.S. elections are a facade. They are run by the public relations industry, who market candidates the same way they market toothpaste and lifestyle drugs. I mean, when you see an ad on television, you know you're not supposed to believe it. You know, it's not an attempt to inform you the way it would be in a market system. It's a way to create uninformed consumers who will make irrational choices, exactly the opposite of what you're taught in an economics class about markets. But business spends huge amounts of money to undermine markets by constructing uninformed consumers who are supposed to make irrational choices. And the same institutions, PR institutions, run the campaigns. And they market candidates the same way. They want an uninformed electorate that will make irrational choices. And in fact, as maybe you know, Obama won an award from the advertising industry for the best marketing campaign of 2008. He beat out Apple Computer. And if you read the business press, executives were euphoric. They said, you know, it's the best we've done since Reagan, when we sort of were able to market him. Now we have an even better achievement. It's going to change the atmosphere in corporate boardrooms, you know, new ways of behaving and portraying ourselves and so on. Yeah, that's the case. And one technique is, if you really want to create an uninformed electorate, you have to keep issues off the agenda. And there's a second reason for that. On issues, both of the political parties are commonly well to the right of the population. So it's important to keep issues off the table, make sure people don't know what they are. So yeah, you're quite right. And what will the result likely be? And my suspicion is an erosion of the base for the Obama campaign, because people will be disillusioned. They shouldn't be, but they will be, and it's understandable. And a very significant backlash. There's a huge group of people in the country who feel they have serious grievances. The grievances go back to the 1970s. The shift of the economy from production to finance, which is a huge shift that took place primarily under Reagan and then Clinton, and of course Bush even more extreme. And that's left a lot of people out in the cold. Majority of the population have seen their wages and incomes stagnate for 30 years. Their benefits decline, services decline, infrastructure collapse, and so on. And they're not happy about it. And they want to know, why is this happening to me? If you listen to talk radio, you get a good sense of it, which I do. When I drive, I listen. The standard person is saying something like, I've done everything right. I'm a hardworking, decent, white Christian. I've done everything right. Why is this happening to me? Well, who's going to give them an answer? They're not going to get an answer from the Republican Party saying, yeah, that's the policies we designed to shaft you and enrich a couple of rich people. And they're not going to get an answer from the Democratic Party saying, well, that's pretty much our policy too, except maybe not as extreme. So they get an answer from Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck, who tell them, well, I got an answer. It's the rich liberals who own the banks and run the government and own the media and don't care about you people, the flyover people. They only care about the rich folk and on the two coasts. They want to give everything away to illegal immigrants and the unworthy poor and so on. So yeah, that's your problem. Well, if that's the only answer you're going to get, people are likely to believe it. And we had experiences like this. It's unfortunately reminiscent of late Weimar Germany, where there also were people with grievances. And they were getting an answer, crazy answer, horrible answer, but happened to take over with consequences we know about. I'm not saying that's going to happen here, but the similarities are not insignificant.
We had a question in the back.
Yeah, hi. As it becomes more apparent that our leadership is complicit with Israel and its occupation by sending $3 billion a year in military aid, and as the demographic in East Jerusalem is changing more rapidly with housing evictions in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and other neighborhoods, and like the Israeli left is shrinking and getting gradually smaller. Do you find hope in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that's been growing in the world, or do you feel that there's other ways of assisting in ending the occupation and other problems in the region?
Well, I think the development of the sanctions movement reflects an understandable and in many ways appropriate reaction to what's going on, but it has some problems that we ought to think through. The sanctions movement is directed against Israel. Okay, that absolves the United States, but the United States is the prime actor in this. Israel can go just as far as the U.S. permits it to, and as far as the U.S. provides the essential support. So tactics are supposed to be educational. And this one is miseducational. It's in fact a gift to the United States, saying, yeah, it's those terrible guys over there. Now, a sanctions program can be effective and sensible, but it has to be formulated properly. BDS, as it's called, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, that's a pretty blunt instrument. You can use it effectively, you can use it badly. To be used effectively, first of all, it ought to be directed against the right target, and it ought to be done in a way which the population, which is defensible, which should take the high moral ground, not be indefensible. For example, it shouldn't be obviously hypocritical. For example, if you boycott, say, an Israeli dance group, it may make Israelis feel bad, but it's totally hypocritical. Why not boycott a U.S. dance group? Say, well, the U.S. has a far worse record of violence and aggression. You're boycotting an Israeli dance group because you can get away with it. They're weak. You can't do it against the United States. Too strong and tough. But anybody can see that that's just total hypocrisy. On the other hand, something like, say, the Amnesty International proposal, that makes a lot of sense. Calling for the U.S. to follow its own laws, and stop sending arms to Israel. First of all, it's directing it against the right target, namely us, and we should always be primarily concerned with ourselves, and that happens to be the appropriate target anyway, and it's completely defensible. The U.S. ought to live up to its laws, and that opens the door to an educational program in making it clear that the U.S. is violating its own laws and international law by sending arms to a country that's engaged in direct aggression, not using it for defensive purposes. This is the first time there have been cases in the past where human rights groups like Human Rights Watch have suggested that the U.S. live up to its own laws by not sending arms to Israel, because there are laws that bar sending arms to laws that engage in systematic torture, as Israel does. But this is much more extensive. This is calling for an overall arms embargo, and it's coming from an impeccable source, Amnesty International, and they have a very good reason, and a defensible reason, and one that can be justified and can be used as a wedge to get people to understand the situation. So that's a sensible BDS program. Others are too. So, for example, a boycott of, say, arms manufacturers, or Caterpillar, which is just destroying the occupied territories. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But you just have to craft these things so that they're sensible. It can be done. Actually, the case of South Africa is a very interesting one. That's usually suggested as a model, but you should really pay some attention to it. The BDS program against South Africa really took off by around 1980. That was at a point where nobody was defending apartheid. Congress was passing legislation against supporting it. Mayors were getting arrested. The press was against it, and so on. And it was after decades of educational programs that got people to oppose apartheid. Okay, at that point, a BDS program made a lot of sense, and it was effective. The Reagan administration, which was a criminal administration beyond the norm, had to evade congressional legislation in order to continue to support its South African allies. And that was no small business. As I mentioned, it led to the killing of probably over 1 million people in the neighboring countries. Well, that was important. And in fact, to finish up on South Africa, a lot of analogies are made between Israel and South Africa. I don't think many of them hold up very well. One reason they don't hold up is that South Africa needed its black population, its African population, badly. They were its workforce. Israel doesn't want the Palestinians. It would be happy if they would disappear. And that's one crucial difference, and it's a difference in the policies that are followed. But there is something to be learned from the history in South Africa. By the early 1960s, South Africa was beginning to become a pariah state. There wasn't a boycott campaign, but there was a lot of condemnation of apartheid, and there were votes in the United Nations, overwhelmingly against apartheid and so on. As that was, the South African nationalists reacted pretty much the same way Israel's reacting. We're right, the world is wrong, they don't understand us. All we need is an information campaign to explain to the world that everything we do is wonderful and perfect. And that's pretty much what's happening now. And it went on for a long time. But the South African foreign minister made a very interesting comment, an astute comment, to the American ambassador. This must be close to 50 years ago. He told the American ambassador, yes, the UN is voting against us, but it really doesn't matter, because you and I know there's only one vote in the United Nations, yours. Okay? And as long as you're backing us, it doesn't matter what the rest of the world is saying. And he was right. And the history showed it. As long as the United States continued to back them, they could get away with whatever they wanted. Didn't matter if the whole world objected. Didn't matter if Congress passed legislation against them. And as late as 1988, the Reagan administration condemned the African National Congress, Mandela, as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. That's 1988. Actually, as you may know, Mandela was just removed from the terrorist list a couple of months ago. That's 1988. Within about 2 years, the United States changed its position for reasons we could debate. But anyway, it did change its position. Mandela was allowed out of the prison at Robbins Island. There were moves towards overcoming apartheid, and within a couple of years, the system was gone. All it takes is that one vote, which happens to be the only vote there is in the United Nations. That's what it means to have overwhelming power. And that's a hopeful sign. It's not the only case. There are other cases like that too. And it means we can really do something if we want to. But we're going to have to focus tactics on what the United States does, not what somebody else does.
Another question? Yes. Right here.
Hi. I have a sort of two-part question. The first is, with the increasing fear-mongering towards the Iranian regime, it seems like an Israeli airstrike it could be quite possible. And if that happens, I think the United States stands to lose more just because we have our troops in both Afghanistan and Iraq. If that happens,
Sorry, I didn't understand the first. Could you repeat the first part? I didn't understand it.
It seems as though there's an increasing chance of an Israeli airstrike on Iran.
An increase in, a threat of an airstrike on Iran?
Right.
Yeah.
And if that happens, I think the USA can lose more than Israel would just because our troops are far closer.
Yeah.
How do we stop an Israeli airstrike when they claim that they're fearing for their existence? And my second question is, our negotiations with Iran have consisted so far of us demanding that they stop. How can we expect this to be a negotiation if we're not willing to budge on on any issue?
If we're not willing to?
Budge on any of the issues, if we haven't offered or we haven't asked them what they want in return and all we're doing is demanding that they stop.
Well, as far as stopping an Israeli airstrike is concerned, that's fairly straightforward. The U.S. just has to tell them you're not going to do it. Okay? Then there won't be an Israeli airstrike. And put teeth into that statement, which of course the U.S. can do. The U.S. is providing the armaments, it has to allow for transit, you know. And in fact, it's happened. Like last summer, for example, summer 2008, so a year and a half ago, right in the midst of the presidential campaign, you know, the most sensitive moment, AIPAC, the main Israeli lobby, was trying to get Congress to pass a resolution calling for a blockade on Iran. Well, that's an act of war. You know, that could have led to a war. And they had gotten a lot of support. You know, a lot of Congress people were lined up and signing. All of a sudden, the campaign ended. There was no indication of why, but it must have been that they just got a message from the White House saying, we don't want a war now, so call off your boys. And the campaign ended. It's right in the middle of a campaign, very sensitive. And that's happened over and over. I mean, Israel and its lobbies here know that they can go only so far. They can go as far as the U.S. lets them. If they tried to do something that the U.S. really opposed, they'd be in serious trouble. And they understand that. You know, they're not suicidal either. So yeah, we can stop it by putting an end to our support for it, or our own threats for that matter. And you can't, it's not 100% guarantee, but pretty safe prospect. As for the negotiations, you know, it's not very clear what they're about, actually. Are we going to try to prevent Iran from exercising the rights of a signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as we're insisting? Well, we can insist on that, but we certainly can't expect the world to go along with us, except for Europe, which, you know, follows obsequiously behind. But outside Europe, the world doesn't accept it. That's why you have the kind of statement I quoted from President Lula of Brazil and the non-aligned countries, which continue to support that right. If we want to negotiate with Iran, we've got to offer them something. And what we should offer them is, first of all, that they should have their rights, but also that we'll put an end to the effort to exclude them from the world. which is serious. No, it's quite serious. Like we now have laws in the United States which bar international banks from dealing with Iran. Well, you can't legally do that, but again, when the Godfather says it, it happens. So the banks don't want to lose. Under the Patriot Act, for example, if a bank is violating U.S. sanctions, it can be barred from action within the United States. That's pretty serious risk for some international banks. So sure, they follow. Well, okay, we could offer opportunities for Iran to enter into the world system, which I think would also be a help to the Iranian reformers. I mean, it's just, the harsher we are in our treatment of Iran, the easier it is for the ruling clerics to get the population to huddle under the umbrella of power for defense. I mean, we know that perfectly well. After 9/11, okay, everybody was willing to accept harsh restrictions, support the government and so on. Yeah, others react that way too. So I think there are steps that can be made. They're not guaranteed to succeed. But we should at least begin by putting an end to the hypocrisy. I mean, you cannot praise President Mubarak of Egypt as a force for stability and good, and then in the next sentence condemn the Iranians for harsh treatment of protesters and expect people not to crack up in laughter outside the highly disciplined West, which of course does what it's told. So there's steps that could be made if there were serious diplomatic interests.
We have time for just one more question from this side. Yes.
Hi. My question is, early in your talk you talked about the threat of Iran being exaggerated and how it's not as big of a threat as the world and the Middle East is making it seem to be. And then later you talked about how no one is admitting to supplying arms to terrorists in Gaza and Lebanon. But you also implied that somebody, Iran, is doing so, and they have admitted it. So how is that not a threat to the Middle East and to the world?
How is it not a threat if Iran violates, say, international agency resolutions and so on?
How is it not a threat if they're providing terrorist organizations?
Oh, surprising terrorist organization. Well, that's an interesting notion, too. According to the United States and its obedient allies, the United States, Iran is supporting terrorist organizations. Okay, well, ask yourself, is that true? I mean, which are the terrorist organizations? I mean, presumably they're providing arms to Hezbollah and to Hamas. Are they terrorist organizations? Well, I mean, Hezbollah is called a terrorist organization because it drove Israel out of southern Lebanon. Okay? Maybe it carried out other terrorist acts, maybe not, but the main charge against Hezbollah is it drove our ally out of an illegal military occupation of southern Lebanon, where our ally was there in violation of Security Council resolutions that went back 22 years. Yeah, they did drive him out. They also defended Lebanon when Israel invaded, its fifth invasion in 2006. Okay, terrorism from one point of view, not from others. We can't expect the world to accept our condemnation of that as terrorism. Well, what about Hamas? Yeah, Hamas, I'd say the Hamas rockets are criminal acts, no doubt. But we're not going to, you can't expect rational people to accept that charge, if they know, as we prevent ourselves from knowing, that there's a very simple way to stop those acts, namely accept a ceasefire. And in fact, there's a more general way. It was pointed out by Nir Rosen, who's one of the best reporters in the region, a very fine reporter. He was asked, he was on Amy Goodman's show, Democracy Now!, a couple of weeks ago, and she asked, what can we do to stop Muslims from killing us? He said, well, stop killing them. Okay, stop killing them, maybe they'll stop killing us. Not a bad answer. So sure, Iran is undoubtedly supporting Hamas and Hezbollah, but as compared with what we do, it's like a toothpick on a mountain. I mean, whatever you think about Hamas, carry out nothing like the violent, murderous acts of Israel and Egypt, which we strongly support. And the same with Hezbollah. They've defended Lebanon. I mean, you may like them or hate them. It's really irrelevant. But, and, you know, maybe they've been involved in some, like, for example, one of the charges against Hezbollah is that they carried out a suicide bombing in 1983 against a U.S. Marine base in Lebanon. Well, actually, it probably wasn't Hezbollah, which you look at experts on the topic, they point out Hezbollah barely existed then. It was probably somebody else. But whoever it was it a terrorist act? I mean, the U.S. military base in Lebanon was being used to bomb and attack Lebanon. That was the time when the U.S. Navy, right offshore, was bombarding the hills over in Lebanon in support of our allies in a civil war. You know, a response to that action is hardly a terrorist act. So you really have to ask yourself, who are the terrorists? You know, they're not nice people. I wouldn't admire. But in fact, they happen to be pretty popular in Lebanon. Here again is you have to be very careful not to believe what you read in the American press. Crucially, like right after there was an election in Lebanon a couple of months ago, and if you read people like, say, Thomas Friedman or everyone else, they were just overjoyed. Friedman was the most extreme as usual. He said, you know, tears come to my eyes when I hear about free elections and on and on. And he said the Lebanese people had a free choice and they voted for Obama and against Ahmadinejad. Because the U.S.-backed coalition won the majority of votes in the parliament. What he didn't tell you, and what the American press didn't report, is that the majority vote went to the Hezbollah-backed coalition. They got 54% of the vote, of the roughly half of the population who voted. And because of the sectarian system in Lebanon, which is a residue of French colonialism, the Shiite population is very much underrepresented. So if you believe in free elections, the Hezbollah-backed coalition won. In fact, won pretty handily. But if you really hate free elections, which is standard here, then they didn't, because the way of manipulating the vote put them in the minority of the legislature. So you know, you can't really say that they're an unpopular group in Lebanon. In fact, the legislature just recently authorized their retaining arms. Well, makes some sense. I mean, if Lebanon has no right of self-defense, yeah, then of course they shouldn't have arms. But if Lebanon does have a right of self-defense, then who else is going to defend it against the next Israeli invasion? I mean, not the Lebanese army. They can't do it. Hezbollah not only can do it, but did do it. So, okay, it's nothing to do with whether you like them or hate them, but you should be a little cautious about using the notion terrorist organization, particularly when we happen to be in the state, which is guilty of far more terrorism than anybody else you can think of, practically.
Before we finish, I'd like to offer a couple of gifts to Professor Chomsky. The first gift is a beautiful bookmark, thanks to our wonderful dean of the School of Education, who's sitting in the back, Hardin Coleman, a true visionary, a true what I call entrepreneur, who BU was lucky to get from the University of Wisconsin. This is from Dean Hardin Coleman and the School of Education.
Thanks very much.
Second, you already have a few for your grandchildren, but one more. This is from Axis of Hope. And on the back, you'll see that it says, Teaching Youth for Peace Beginning Today. That's for you also. Thank you all for coming.